Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. I'm Rob Draper, and welcome to Single Malt TV. Today we're stepping into the world of independent bottling and one of the most distinctive names in whiskey, Douglas Laing Company. Founded in 1948 and still family owned, Douglas Laing has built a reputation not just for the whiskey in the bottle, but for how that whiskey is presented, from regional blended malts like Big Peat and Timorous Beastie to a very clear and often playful approach to labelling. Joining me is Dougal Barr. He's the global brand ambassador for Douglas Laing and someone who spends a great deal of time presenting these whiskies and communicating the Douglas Laing philosophy to audiences around the world. Recently, the company has taken a significant step with the acquisition of Strathearn Distillery, moving from being an independent bottler to creating spirit. So today we're going to explore both sides of that journey. What defines the Douglas Laing approach to whiskey? How do you choose casks when you don't distill the spirit yourself? And how does that thinking change when you become a distiller? So let's get to it. Dougal, great to have you with us, mate. And let me just click you on. Here we go. G'day, mate.
Hey, Rob, how are you?
I'm bloody good.
It's a good way to start.
Yeah. Now, could you hear me?
I couldn't hear you in your introduction there, no.
Actually, that's because I had you turned off.
That's fine. Don't worry. I can be a mystery to me as long as people can hear us.
That's okay. So here we are. So let's dive straight into this, and I think the best place to start is as we said earlier on, with a little bit of the backstory of Douglas Laing, where it came from and where we are today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're third generation is probably a good place to kind of highlight, if you like. So it's coming into our 77th year, 77th year now. So the family remains 100% in control, completely independent of any outside interfering. No big faceless corporation here. So 100% owned within the family. So going all the way back to 1948, we start with Fred Douglas Laing. So yeah, there's the man himself. So Fred, like many gentlemen coming out of the Second World War, he was a pilot in the RAF during the war, and coming out of that, like many people, were looking for different opportunities, and certainly from his son and his granddaughter's descriptions of him, he was apparently entrepreneurial, is a good way to put it. I think he was always happy to try different things, and found himself working for, it's actually a US-based company, kind of import-export, lots of different things, but some of that included champagne and Scotch whiskey. So Fred found himself kind of their man in Scotland, sourcing the liquid for their blended Scotch, kind of organising casking, blending, bottling, and shipment. So he was kind of their man that was travelling about the country, putting together this blend. So the blend itself was called the King of Scots, which is a cracking name for a whiskey. And basically the resulting kind of process of this was, for 3 years after the war, Fred was kind of, let's say, in charge of King of Scots. And then 1948, they were kind of running down the end of those stocks, and Fred got the opportunity to purchase the kind of remnants of stock. He got the chance to purchase the brand and the kind of the overall title and recipe of what he was working with. And in 1948, he established Douglas Laing Co. with the one brand, King of Scots. And that's how we got our start, but no whiskey to continue on. So he was back to exactly what he was doing before, of driving around Scotland, knocking on doors, asking, could I get some casks? Could I get enough whiskey together to make a batch of the blend? So that's really how Douglas Laing started, was proper door-to-door wheeling and dealing.
Oh, wow.
In style.
So it really did start as a backyard operation almost.
Yeah, exactly. And that's good. And the King of Scots brand goes all the way back into the 1880s. So the King of Scots blended Scotch has been around for a very long time. But essentially, it predates Douglas Laing, if you like. But for us, Douglas Laing Co., we are officially starting in 1948. So that is it, with the one brand of King of Scots. I have our just off to the side there. This was kind of our celebration, but this is kind of our 50-year-old King of Scots. So showcasing kind of a couple of years ago some of the amazing stock that we've got floating around. So that brand still plays a big part for us. So we're still making it today. Not
So
necessarily.
when would that have been bottled?
So that 50-year-old we bottled a couple of years ago for our 75th anniversary.
Oh,
so
right.
We did a super small batch. It was I think just over 1,000 bottles got made, kind of really showcasing we've got some amazing stock sitting in a warehouse. But the King of Scots was our original brand and still making it today.
Oh, that's fantastic. So once it moved on, then this next generation came in, and how did it?
Yeah, so
it's kind of pretty fast.
For anyone that's kind of followed Douglas Laing's journey, I guess, if you like. So who you have there on the screen? So Fred Senior, original Fred, because I'm about to start talking about second Fred, or current Fred. So Fred and his brother Stuart were both actively involved in the family business from young ages. In Fred's case, on record, I'm not sure. Wouldn't get away with it today, but essentially Fred was taken out by his dad to South America when he was in his mid-teens, so kind of 14, 15 years old. He was already out in the school of life, learning how to sell Scotch whisky with his dad. So I think the brothers were always destined to work in the whisky industry. But kind of before their dad fully brought them into the business, both of them spent time with different distillers and different companies around Scotland, kind of learning the trade again. So Fred, from kind of 1968, 69 through to 1970, 72, he was working initially at White & Mackay. He actually joined the same year as Richard Patterson. So if any of your
Right.
In terms of name dropping in whiskey, Richard Patterson's a good one. So Fred and, in his own words, Dickie joined White & Mackay in the same year. And actually, so Fred's initial kind of stepping into the world of his dad was learning to blend from Major Hartley White, so of White & Mackay. So again, couldn't really ask for better people to be around.
It's like the history of the entire Scotch whisky industry.
Absolutely, yeah. And so Fred was kind of already in that point. So his dad had kind of learned blending on the go. So he's kind of keen that his sons went out and worked for different distillers, different companies, brought that in, kind of knowledge back into the family business.
Yeah.
So then Fred came back into the family business in 1972, and him and his brother Stuart ran the business with their dad until Fred Senior passed away in 1984. And from that point, the kind of business passed on to the second generation, still really focused in on blending. It was very much blended Scotch, different ranges kind of within the King of Scots. We had a lot of success with ceramics and kind of giftable styles of Scotch whisky. You name it, we bottled into golf club style heads. We bottled into all these amazing, crazy decanters that were a lot in the kind of Pacific Rim as well. So we did a lot.
Well, I think, didn't Douglas Laing produce a particular bottle for the Scottish Open?
Yeah, so we did, and then the kind of a John Player special, which became kind of a real focus. You have that kind of black and gold livery style. But it was literally golf bags, decanters, so you can literally take the top off and you have blended Scotch whisky. So
the only reason I know that is because I think Charlie McLean's got one, and I saw it at his house, and I've never forgotten that. It was like, wow, that is a fantastic way to market yourself.
Oh, it was phenomenal, and we had huge success with it in the kind of into the 80s when you have this dip of Scotch whisky in general. You obviously have all these mothballing distilleries, and Douglas Laing was doing pretty damn well, if we're being honest about it. And a lot of this was kind of recognizing a niche for very highly giftable kind of premium blends, so kind of 15, 17, 21-year-old, 25-year-old blended Scotch, especially in the kind of early days, duty-free travel, tax-free travel. So we had a huge amount of success in these kind of early days. And then kind of the next step, if you like, to get us to the modern day, this was when 2013, it's pretty well known that Douglas Laing was divided between Fred and Stuart. So the two brothers split Douglas Laing down the middle. Fred keeping the Douglas Laing name, and Stuart going off to essentially establish Hunter Laing & Co. So you have kind of two sides of the Douglas Laing family. And in 2013, with that split, it was at that point Fred brought in his daughter, third generation, and our current managing director of Cara, Laing. So you have the kind of passing over, if you like, into the business in 2013. And then since that point, Cara's held a number of different positions since joining the family business. But today you find Fred, I was going to say Fred has stepped back a little bit. I wouldn't say stepped back too far. He's still in the office 5 days a week. But Cara is now our managing director, and Fred holds a kind of chairman role, if you like, but still very much active in the business.
Keeping a watchful eye over the operation.
Well, yeah, it's amazing in terms of, again, Cara's slightly different route. Obviously, her grandfather and her father both being so active in the whiskey industry. I think there was a bit of a reaction to not want anything to do with whiskey from Cara's side. So Cara's at university studying a marketing degree, and then found herself again working for White & Mackay, and very quickly found herself as a brand manager for Jura. And then from Jura and White & Mackay, she moved over to Morris and Bowmore Distillers, where she was brand manager for the likes of Bowmore, Auchentoshan, Glengarry. And then at that point came from her world of learning the trade and bringing that knowledge back into the family business. So Cara joined.
When was she at Morris and Bowmore?
So it would have been up until 2013, and I think it was about 2008, 2009, I think she started there.
Yeah, because I think I'm pretty sure I met her there one time when I was over there filming at Auchentoshan.
Yep, wouldn't surprise me. Yeah, so at that point she would have been the brand manager for the brands. Yeah. And it kind of makes sense if when we look at this year, Cara is celebrating 20 years in the industry, on the basis that Cara's very early into her 40s. So it shows you how much the family have been involved with the Scotch whisky industry when you're already celebrating 20 years in the industry.
Yeah, that's not bad.
And likewise, and Fred's just turned 75, and he's over 60 years. Again, it gives you a good impression of when he might have started.
Yeah. Well, when you you guys have sort of focused primarily on blended whiskies, and was that the goal right from the start to always make blends, or was there a goal to split off and do more single malts, or was in the back of everyone's mind, was there the thing that one day we're going to be distillers?
Well, I think it's interesting because I'm lucky enough that this is my 5th year with Douglas Laing. I know Fred and Cara pretty well in terms of day-to-day, just chatting away. And I think certainly Cara doesn't remember too much of her grandfather. Obviously him passing away in 1984, so there's not too much memory there. But Fred talks about his dad, and certainly they discuss the fact he probably wouldn't recognize the business and where we are today. So when Fred Senior passed away, we were a blending house. That was what we were. We were a blending producer, or blends producer. And since that point, that kind of growing interest in single malts and this, I don't like to call it surplus because it makes it sound like a negative, but we had a phenomenal selection of casks that we'd built up in our own stores, if you like, and kind of slowly built up this idea of moving away from reactivity of reacting to the market, whereas we could now lay down stock and plan out for the future, which is certainly how we operate today. So we had a phenomenal array of casks from across Scotland, and seeing this increased interest in single malt, especially in that kind of like early 90s, and seeing the likes of Gordon MacPhail, Caden Heads, Berry Brothers and Rudd, these kind of very well-known, successful independent bottlers out there in the world, we looked at, doesn't take too much to look at your stock and realize there's an opportunity there. So in the 1990s, you saw Douglas Laing pivot a little bit more to a lot of people discovered us as an independent bottler and maybe wouldn't have realized that we existed 60 years before that as a blender. And then that kind of really carried us through into the 2000s until we find ourselves in that 2008, 2009 window. And that is us sitting, again, we talk a little bit, it sounds like a negative, an excess stock of Islay malts in particular. Again, we plan out for certain blends to contain certain peated elements, and we were sitting on an overabundance of Islay stock. And that is what kind of led us back into the world of blending, but the creation of, I think it's safe to say, our most famous brand out there in the world, which is Big Peat. And so Big Peat was a result of our planning for blending prior, and then our kind of redevelopment into Douglas Laing as an independent bottler. And then Big Peat brought us back to that route of blending, but in a slightly different form.
Yeah, and Well, we're talking about Big Peat. I mean, one of the things that, and I had a lot of questions about your labeling,
Yep.
because your the labeling is quite quite individual, and and I had this question from someone, and they said, does the labeling drive the whiskey, or does the whiskey drive the labeling?
Interesting. So I think we often run along the tagline of we're a very brand-led company in general. Just with nature, when you have labels that stick out this way, you can't be too subtle about it. But on the other hand, I think we've always tried to do whiskey the right way, and I think that's the big emphasis here. There's no sacrifice of quality. We can have something a bit more fun, a bit different. We're not tartan and bagpipes and over the top Scottishness in your face. And it's about making whiskey that little bit more accessible, making whiskey that little bit more almost relaxed, a bit more easygoing. Like, yes, Big Peat, as you can kind of see, that's well, one, it's me, but it's me in front of Port Ellen Lighthouse there. But yeah, Big Peat itself, yes, it seems like, and there's nothing to do with Captain Haddock. We get to clear that up early. Nothing to do with Tintin and Captain Haddock. But yeah, so Big Peat looks like a bit of fun, but as soon as you dial into it and you look at the distilleries, and we put these on the front of the label, and we talk about containing distilleries including Ardbeg, Kalila, Bowmore, and Port Ellen, you couldn't ask for a better heavy-hitting list of Islay whiskies. So while the labels are quite fun and funky, there's no moving away from the quality of liquid that's going in. And so for us,
the interesting thing with the labeling is also that the company name sort of takes a back row to the name of the actual whiskey, and was again, obviously that was an intentional thing, and I wonder why that was.
I think, well, part of it is also the range, the regional malts that you kind of see around me, kind of floating all over. So this whole series, this idea wasn't necessarily a thought out plan initially. It was kind of, we had Big Peat for 4 years before we developed the follow-up to Big Peat, if you like, which was Scallywag, or Speyside blended malt or vatted malt. And for us, Big Peat, we often talk about, oh, there you go, perfect, nice opportunity to have our own Scallywag in it. But there wasn't necessarily a planned regional series where some people probably would have maybe put Douglas Laing front and center and then the individual names in a smaller font somewhere else. These all kind of became their own identity, and we don't really talk about Big Peat being this. It's a he. He exists in our minds. That we always refer to Big Peat as an actual person, because it kind of developed this kind of larger than life element to it. And Scallywag, it's basically how some of the reason we have the Wire Fox Terrier on the bottle is the family, going all the way back to Fred Douglas Laing, have always had Wire Fox Terriers. They love the dog, and they've always referred to them as their Scallywags. So Scallywag is not the actual name of the dog on the bottle. The dog on the bottle of Scallywag is Binks. But there's all these nice little touches to the family in terms of, like, say, Big Peat, if you take a trip to Islay.
But the naming of the whiskies has really got nothing to do with someone tasting it and saying, "Oh, a great name for this would be such and such." It was just a bunch of people sat around and said, "Oh, let's call it Scallywag, or let's call it Big Peat." Or
I think as they kind of develop, there's certain names within the range that we've kind of wanted links to. Big Peat and Scallywag were kind of the original two. Big Peat was the result of an early reaction to the whiskey. So pre-naming, there was an early sniff of the combination of Big Peat, and an early reaction was a Big Peat reaction, which is why you have that kind of, it's very visceral, kind of gives you exactly what we're expecting. But it's not actually as big as people expect. Big Peat is not a punch in the face. What we capture in the bottle, that the grimacing look, is maybe a little bit more someone's first experience of Islay whiskey. A lot of people pull that face. Or for you're visiting Islay in the summer and you've got the wind and the rain hitting you in the face, there's a lot of people that pull that Big Peat face, but not necessarily coming into it with that name. Whereas Scallywag, the nice link to the family dog, there's kind of this idea of doing that. And certainly another one, our kind of Highland bottling, is Timorous Beastie. And we always wanted a link to Burns without being an overt Robert Burns, like
Yeah.
this is Robert Burns single malt or something like that. And we always liked the name Timorous Beastie. And we've always had these elements of we like the name, we do that. Another one that I've got in my glass is a Rock Island, which started life as Rock Oyster. So there's certain ones that have developed, the names have changed slightly. So they kind of always been like some are led by the brand in terms of the style of whiskey we're trying to make. Some are led by we think this is a better representation of the region, or we can create a story around it. Because they're not coming with a Glen, whatever, we don't have that same provenance, if you like, in terms of there's a set you name it after the local valley or you name it after the local loch. We don't really have that. We get a little bit more freedom to create a name that we can create a story to.
Well, from a marketing point of view, do you find that the labels attract a particular audience, or do you find it seems to me that, I mean, I love the labels. I you know, from the first time we talked, the thing that I love about them is the labels are just awesome. But there's people who don't take it seriously because of the labels.
I think there's definitely a percentage of that where it happens, and that's where we really still live and breathe by the liquid to lips profile in terms of we got to get people trying our whiskey to understand it. I think a lot of people get drawn in just with that initial "what the hell is this?" as also it works in the positive in that way of I don't even know what this is. But sometimes that I would say a smaller and smaller percentage. I think we've seen the whiskey demographic change a little bit. We've seen it's not just ourselves. You have so many creative whiskey companies out there that people are just now accepting that you get a little bit more playful, a little bit more creative with it.
Well, don't take it quite. It's not quite so much gentlemen sitting in squeaky leather lounges in front of a fire smoking their pipe and
certainly through Fred's descriptions of when we first had Big Peat, and it was just kind of by itself. And in 2009, there wasn't really too much like Big Peat around. Like you had kind of early days of people like Compass Box, things like that. You had
that was really before Octomore came out too.
Yep. And even then, you've got, like, if you want to compare it in terms of the category, you had stuff like Monkey Shoulder, but Monkey Shoulder was in bars, it was for mixing, it was for cocktails. That was never the point of the whiskey we make. We make whiskey as a competitor to like our blended range or our blended malt range, as we want these to be single malt beaters. We don't want these to be instantly pouring whiskey in the back bar, like in a bar or cocktail bar. So Fred's early reactions to Big Peat were, oh, I don't want to try that because the label looks ridiculous. And so Fred would always have a bottle of unmarked Big Peat under the table that he'd always pull out and be, oh yeah, you clearly know your whiskey, I'll get you something special from under the table. And he'd just pour them a glass of Big Peat, but without the label. And it's really very much a challenge to don't judge a book by its cover. Like there's no sacrifice of what we're doing here. It's all about just doing whiskey in a slightly different way. And the bottle you've got there behind me is one of my favorite ones we've done recently, kind of really showing not only the creative side, but also how we can utilize different cask types and let that feed into the branding and the marketing side of things. So this was our Rock Island that was finished in tequila casks. So Claire, our head of design, created this hand-drawn label that's a full wrap on the bottle.
Yeah, the label's fantastic.
All these kind of nice touches and nods to kind of the heritage of the cask. And we've done this multiple times now where we've linked into where the cask came from. It kind of helps story build, and instantly you're pulling in a totally different audience for this.
Yeah. Do you find it does appeal to that younger, like the 25 to 45 demographic?
I'd say so. I think it's kind of where we do very well in terms of we kind of have something for everyone. Because don't get me wrong, Big Peat's a quarter of what we do. Like Big Peat is a huge part of what we do. Yeah. So clearly it works for an older generation of whiskey drinkers and also a younger generation of whiskey drinkers. But certainly the regional series, we kind of designed this almost like, now it sits almost like you try these 6 whiskies, our regional series, you will sample the flavor profiles of Scotland. We're not saying it's the only regional styles anymore. I think that's kind of out the window, but certainly you will get a good understanding, a good concept of Scotch whiskey flavors if you sample these 6 whiskies.
Yeah.
But on the other side of the business, we've got still the independent bottling side, which is kind of what you see my kind of top section here, our old particular range. which is far more classic, and I think far more to your your kind of signature whiskey or aficionados, the people that know what a single cask is. So you've just very much more straightforward distillery, age, type of cask, when it was distilled, when it was bottled, and far more what people might expect for Scotch whiskey.
Yeah. So with all the blending that's gone on, now all of a sudden you guys are into the distilling side of it.
Yeah,
so
it was kind of.
How did that exactly come about? Because it must be a pretty big move to go from being an independent bottler to all of a sudden getting into the whole distillation process.
I think there's kind of, I think you see it now more and more, especially with lots of other independent bottlers. You've seen the likes of G&M, obviously with their distilling side. You see a lot of the newer ones, like Brave New Spirits, etc., building distilleries. From a commercial aspect, it always makes sense to have your own supply, if you like, in terms of filling your own spirit into your own whiskies versus giving you trading stock. Often, for maybe for people in the background, don't recognise how collaborative the Scotch whisky industry really is. So we operate almost like a symbiotic relationship with distillers and other independent bottlers, where we have access to different distilleries. We might get X amount of liquid every year, and then we can fill that into our own choice of wood, our own maturation. That might sometimes find that we've got a gap. Maybe there's a certain region that we don't have as much of, but we know someone else does. And then you have that conversation. And then this is where kind of some back and forth might happen between casks, between independent bottlers. But then if you've got your own distillery, suddenly you're in a position where you can trade spirit for spirit. And that puts you in a much better standing in terms of get 1,000 litres of this for 1,000 litres of that. And this idea of being able to craft something from that perspective in independent bottling and blending.
So but you will still be an independent bottler and a distiller at the same time. So you'll be doing both.
Absolutely. So they kind of work harmoniously. We see it more, it's almost like kind of completing our triangle, if you like. So as a blending house, we're relying on getting liquid from other distilleries. As an independent bottler, we're relying on others being able to bring in either, for us predominantly, we are filling our own casks, or at least filling new make spirit, age zero spirit in and maturing it ourselves, rather than buying aged stock and just putting it in a bottle. We kind of like to have a bit more influence on the final product. But then, the kind of third piece of that, or kind of, the third corner of that triangle is distilling. And that's kind of always the idea, was being able to do all different aspects of Scotch whisky. So there was always a running plan in the background for Douglas Laing to become a distiller. Strathearn was a little bit of a result of different challenges that we've had. It was pretty common knowledge out there in the world that we were planning a distillery in the heart of Glasgow. So it was going to be down beside the river. So this is the Clutha Distillery, which was still in the back burner, but essentially Clutha offered some challenges that I know the likes of Clydeside have had with their challenges as they've established themselves in the city centre as well, is warehousing and not being allowed to store certain things within the city, and environmental concerns. And so we'd actually kind of slowly pushed out, and we actually got a chance to do things a little bit in reverse. So we got the opportunity to establish our own bottling line and our own warehousing here just on the outside of Glasgow. We're kind of between the city centre and Glasgow Airport. So it gave us the opportunity to first establish, rather than relying on third parties for bottling and things like that. We now brought everything in-house. So we could now bring our own casks in, do our own blending on site. And so a distilling point, again, was still sitting there in the background, but we didn't quite reach that point. But we had the name, we had the designs, we had everything kind of good to go. And then Fred and Cara were essentially approached about Strathearn, the group that had started Strathearn back in 2013. Approached them in kind of end of 2018, early 2019, and it was kind of well known that we were in the market for looking into the world of distilling, and Strathearn came up as an opportunity to have a distillery that was already producing spirit and making a spirit that was really interesting, but had maybe reached a point where they needed some a bit more establishment to come in, someone a bit more established with brands and brand building and building up a Strathearn following, if you like, because they had only really released one small batch of Strathearn whiskey into the world, so it hadn't really ever reached the world, despite being 6 years old as a distillery. And so we kind of got the opportunity to buy into Strathearn as it was already established. But at the time, I'm pretty sure I've heard different figures around it. Everyone argues about these, but I'm pretty sure we were the smallest producer in Scotland when Douglas Laing got involved, making around 25,000 litres a year, which in Scottish world, very, very small. But since that point, we've kind of increased production overall, but we're still one of the smallest in the country. So we bought Strathearn in 2019 as a result of being approached, because it was known that we were on the hunt or on the market and interested in some different distillery potentials.
Well, the thing that comes to mind is when you're working as an independent bottler, you've got such incredible access to an incredible variety of new make that you can put into your casks of choice. But once you go to distilling, do you think that's going to narrow the scope of the company, or it won't have any impact?
Honestly, I think so. We've had Strathearn since 2019. We released our first Strathearn into the world in 2024. So we waited for another 5 years. So we actually had spirit that was over 10 years old by the time we actually released something from Douglas Laing. So we did our kind of inaugural Strathearn in 2024. It was only 12,000 bottles for the world in 2024. So it was a combination of 32 casks. For 2025, we did 31 casks and 12,000 bottles for the world. And that was it. And 2026, batch number 3 is coming in the summer. And that's going to be around about the same volume again. So in terms of Douglas Laing overall, the answer is no. It's not going to change what we do.
Pretty small.
Yeah. So if you look at Strathearn as a whole, we make basically one shift, which is essentially kind of a day's work, if you like. We're making 1 barrel's worth of spirit a day. So about 225, 250 litres max every single day.
Oh, wow.
So when you look at in a year's production, we will produce somewhere between 55 and 60,000 litres a year. And compared to your Glenfiddicks and Macallans of the world, and your
and Glenmorangie with those with the 10 of the biggest stills anywhere on the planet.
So we're pretty small scale. So it's not going to something like Strathearn doesn't dramatically change what we do. It's just a really nice complementary piece to us being able to continue with our kind of same approach. So judging single casks that we think are worthy of being put in a bottle and putting them out into the world, or combining these casks into our regional malts. Strathearn is still going to be done in a small scale, really interesting process, and batch by batch initially, just to kind of put it out into the world. But it's never going to be a big volume distillery, because
gives you another string on your violin, or another bow in your quiver.
Exactly. So it's very much it's the guys up there run like a really nice little place, but we're at capacity because it's one room essentially. Like we cannot expand because it's one small barn, which is part of a farmsteading just outside of Perth in the Lower Highlands.
I put up these stills because we were talking about it yesterday. They're kind of unusual, and they had an interesting story, but it sort of fits in with what you were saying about only producing 20 to 25,000 litres a year. You wouldn't be able to produce that much more out of those, would you?
No, so these are Portuguese-made Hoga stills. So a lot of people will know Forsyths in Scotland tend to make most of the copper stills for most of your big distillers in Scotland. And the Hoga stills that you see here, often people like kind of this alembic style, people think we might be making Armagnac or Cognac or something like that as well. They're essentially off the shelf. So basically they are not custom designed shapes for us. They are essentially the ones you now see here are as big as you can possibly go with these in terms of like just being able to buy them as you see them. So there's not any level of everything around them can be kind of customized, and how you run them can be customized. But the actual physical stills themselves, if you look around craft distillers, not just in Scotland, but kind of globally, you'll see a lot of these around in terms of ready to go, easy access. And it makes sense when Strathearn was first started back in 2013, that when you're first starting a distillery and you just want to get going making spirit, then something like this makes sense.
Yeah, I was saying yesterday too, there's, I think there are a few distilleries in Australia that have these Portuguese stills. Because I think I've seen some pictures of them, and probably, and you were mentioning also you can carry them.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, you see the handle in that picture. So the ones you see here, so we've increased capacity since Douglas Laing took over. We basically essentially up to the biggest volume you can get. So we have got 2 wash stills of 1,000 litres and 1 spirit still of 1,000 litres. So when I was working at Auchentoshan, you were talking like 33,000 litres, things like it's scale thing here is very, very small.
I mean, really, it's like a boutique whiskey making.
100%. Yeah, we firmly see this as still as like as a craft distillery. It's very much so. But yeah, the handles on the side, the new ones that we just replaced in, because as you well know, that the copper thins out and we do have to replace them. Yeah, you can just literally have 2 or 3 of you carry them in. It's amazing. It's like now, bring it wherever you like to go.
Now, what do you do your own maltings, and or do you bring the malt in?
No, so it's interesting. So one of the main attractions of Strathearn originally that we've kept throughout is we're using a type of barley called Maris Otter. So Maris Otter is not common in Scotch whisky at all because it's very expensive and you don't get a high alcohol yield from it. So when you're doing big volume, you'd be financially crippling yourself almost immediately if you decide to do a big production this way, especially because we do 100% Maris Otter. But Maris Otter is really well known in the brewing trade for kind of texture. It's amazing for this kind of big and creamy and cereal-led style. And so the Strathearn New Make already had this kind of style thanks to the Maris Otter. So it's something we kind of kept going. So we don't have any space for malting or anything like that. And certainly the amounts that we're using, having a malting floor, we could in theory, I guess, look at doing it, but it's not something we ever had, as it was a long-term lease as part of this farmsteading, just nowhere to do it. So it's Crisp Maltings does our malting for us. Barley sourced as locally as possible, but this batches of Maris Otter goes to Crisp and delivered to us in 25 kilogram bags, with a single mash being 400 kilograms. And until very recently, the guys were having to carry these individual bags up a set of stairs and hand drop them into the mash tun. When we talk about kind of going back to almost like 200-year-old distilling, the guys were carrying malt up and dropping it in. And yeah, there's some pretty unique elements for Strathearn.
Yeah. So what about, are you making original peated malts, or are you staying away from peated malts?
So we stayed away from, there was some peated done before Douglas Laing was actively involved. So there is some peated Strathearn spirit out there, but very, very small numbers. You can imagine, well, essentially you're producing 100 casks a year. So a small fraction of that might have been some peated malt out there. We've stayed away from it, but we are looking at it as the potential for introducing it. We kind of wanted to establish almost like our house style. So Angela Brown and her team there are all from a brewing background, all kind of came from a brewer's background at Strathearn's, all of their first roles in the Scotch whisky industry. But Angela's just 32, 33 and has already won Spirits Business Distiller of the Year and has already been a chairwoman of the Institute of Brewing and Distilling at the age of 32. Oh, wow. Like, Angela's kind of unbelievably good, and so are Matthew and Craig. So you can see, that's literally Craig carrying the 25 kilo bags of malt. And so it's pretty rustic, pretty rough and ready. But potentially my favourite thing about Strathearn, for anyone that's kind of knows about Scotch whisky or has visited a distillery, and you reach distillation and you have the spirit safe, where you have this kind of locked glass cabinet where you have your spirit running freely out of it. And typically this was introduced as a taxman blockade, if you like, so you wouldn't have access to your spirit unless the taxman was there. And you can have big padlock glass cabinets. You'll notice that's the New Make spirit that Craig is stirring in that picture. So there is no sample safe, and we don't really base anything on. We know obviously rough timings, rough temperatures, but the final cuts for selecting our heart cut, if you like, that's done by taste. So the guys are dipping a finger underneath the running spirit from the spirit still. We will wait for detecting the change in the spirit that we're looking for. We'll start to cut, and then we will make that close off heart cut. It's pretty unique. So there's not many distilleries that have open spirit running and heart.
Talk about going back to first principles.
Yeah, it's amazing. I love it. It's such a special little distillery. And if anyone ever comes, we don't have a visitor centre because a tour would take about 30 seconds because you can stand at the front door and see the full distillery. So it's a pretty amazing little distillery, like long fermentations, like 140-hour plus fermentations. Again, that's kind of well over double what you'd expect for a typical single malt distillery in Scotland. So yeah, really lots of little unique parts to develop a really big style of whiskey.
And I got another picture here for you.
Yep. So like say, a really young team, all brewers by trade originally, and kind of Angela leading the team there. So she's now been over 5 years, I think, with Strathearn. So really kind of overseeing the liquid that has become our kind of inaugural bottlings of Strathearn.
Yeah. Now what? There's the.
All right. So yeah, this is our bottling. So again, this is where I cannot stress how lucky we are to have such a talented bunch of people behind Douglas Laing Design. And kind of, I didn't really mention it too much, but there's really a small marketing team, and then Claire is our kind of head of creative. Everything that comes out of Douglas Laing, all the limited editions, it's basically one person that is designing these looks, these labels. Claire designed Strathearn. She designed the bottle, label, everything that has been done in-house. There's no big brand team that is doing this. It's all done in-house. So things like the Strathearn bottle you have there on screen, all of the acorn design, so our kind of nice little tagline of from small acorns, mighty oaks grow, this kind of idea of something small can become something mighty, oak being so tied in to Scotch whiskey overall. There's always really nice little touches. It's a very tactile bottle.
It's a nice looking bottle, and it's a nice looking label that would look good on a shelf.
Yep, and that's certainly it's something we have to kind of consider now, is making bottles that we want people to, once they're empty, we want people to still want to hang on to them. I think the Isle of Harris is a great example of this with their gin, where suddenly every restaurant in the UK, the water on the tables was suddenly served in the Harris gin bottles once they're empty, just because they're such a beautiful bottle. And so this idea of making a bottle that someone would want to keep.
Now that's good. That's good marketing.
Yeah, exactly. And it sits there and continues on. So yeah, certainly the idea with Strathearn was kind of creating the storyline. It's such a small little distillery, and oak trees are around for hundreds of years. So hopefully Strathearn will be too.
Well, tell me, if you were going to say to someone, before I ask you this question, tell me about the new Scallywag.
Oh yeah, so yeah, you put up that picture of that was actually a Cooper, which was the dog with the bottle in there.
Yeah, let me go back to him. Where is he? Here
our kind of classic style. So yeah, so this is our something a little bit fancy and a little bit new. So this only just launched a couple of weeks ago. So this is our brand new Scallywag release for this year. So this is, again, we're talking about label development and how we can make sure that they can still be fun and not maybe as traditional as you see them, but still give a degree of elegance and develop into kind of something a little bit more refined. So this is being an 18-year-old version of the Scallywag.
This to me, like I said before, this to me looks like this is a serious whiskey.
Yeah. So this is kind of the full bottle here that I've got in my hand. So it's kind of decanter style bottle. World's largest.
Hang on, let me put you on the big side of the screen there.
Yes, there you go. So, but like I say, the most ridiculous oversized cork. It takes a full hand to hold the cork. Yeah, this kind of idea of elevating our Scallywag into something worthy of being an 18-year-old. That kind of idea that someone's spending, in our case, £85 for a bottle of Scallywag 18. We want it to feel worth that as well. Yeah, and we've done the same with a lot of the regional malts. They allow us to we can have the kind of classic range that have that super accessible, quite fun and funky branding. But when we do a limited edition or a special edition, we can take it to a step up the way. So that I have kind of our Big Peat winter edition from last year. So again, it still keeps Big Peat's identity, but we can kind of make it this kind of slightly more elevated style. So that was our winter edition of Big Peat for this year, which was a Madeira cask finish. But again, it's just about how we develop the brand. So Big Peat's been around and pretty much unchanged since 2009. So we are slowly tweaking and developing and seeing, without moving too far one way, away from the fun and the kind of the funkier side of Scotch whiskey. But something like that Scallywag 18 really highlights you can still keep the funness of the Wire Fox Terrier being on the bottle. You can still keep the Scallywag essence, but it doesn't mean that you're limited to keeping it as a easy access style whiskey. You can bring something up to a super premium level.
Yeah, the Big Peat's funny because when I've done a few live streams with folks from Australia, and David Ligoff was telling me that there's a guy in Sydney who's got every release of Big Peat that's ever been made, and except one, and he's trying to get it. And I said, I could give you a call and see if he can find it.
You never know what we've got sitting in a warehouse gathring dust. There's a lot of Big Peats out there.
The guy's just absolutely bonkers over Big Peat, and that became his lifelong obsession. Everywhere he goes in the world, he finds another one. He has to buy it.
There's a couple other gentlemen. There's a gentleman in Germany and a gentleman in Finland who are also avid Big Peat collectors. So you never know. My favorite thing is
the thing that's great is the labels are so good on them.
Yeah, there's Big Peat tattoos out in the world. We've got.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, we've got over 40 as far as I'm aware. Big
well, look,
tattoos.
As the brand ambassador, you should have one.
I've not been signed up yet. I've got a few around, but I've not been. I'll wait for friend Cara's pay rise, and then I'll have investigated into it. But yeah, there's a gentleman that's got all the regional malts tattooed down his arm and things like that, and I've seen them with Big Peat carrying Swiss flags. Like I've seen every kind of thing. So it's really developed this kind of cult following, and I think it is because it stands out as being quite different, quite funky. So
yeah,
but it's still serious whiskey. I think that's a nice thing about it.
Yeah. Now, if someone came up to you and they said, what 3 whiskies should I try to give me a really good understanding of the house style of Douglas Laing, what three whiskies would you pick?
Interesting. I think now I probably would include Strathearn because I think it is very much our present day, if you like, but I think it still kind of carries the same ethos that we've always had. And I think it's such a unique, it's really big and really robust, even though it's in its early points. And that's one thing I've got people trying it. So we're bottling it 50% ABV, only these 32 casks going in. It is genuinely small batch. I think for me, that kind of really sits with like, this is our distillery. So this is our house style for our distillery. I think within the regional malts, I think you have to try Big Peat. I think it's got such a strong core recipe. You can really tell that we've been making it for 16 years. I think it really shows that it's just super consistent because again, they're all done in small batches as they go. So there's been natural variation in these regional malts over the years as different distilleries have come in and out of use within the blend. So they have always kind of changed a little bit. But Big Peat has got such a strong, this is Big Peat. It's really well balanced. It does exactly what you want it to do. It is Islay in a bottle, but without the extremes. It's just really approachable Islay.
Yeah.
And for me, in terms of like the single cask range, you kind of see above us that kind of old particular range. Where, like many people in the industry, people always ask, "Oh, what's your favorite cask type?" And lots of us will often answer like bourbon hogshead or like a refill bourbon hogsheads because it really lets the distillery style shine through. It doesn't have this really dominant style of cask influence. We've moved away a little bit as an industry, I think. We've moved into, for a long time, sherry was the big thing, and now we're filling into lots of really active wine casks, and you're often hiding a lot of the distillery DNA in there. So we've got a very good reputation out in the world, and certainly a lot of the feedback I get being out in front of people probably the most often is people love the fact that we're still using kind of refill bourbon hogsheads, softer cask influence, so really letting distillery DNA shine through. So
Yeah.
I would choose any kind of like bourbon hogshead, Old Particular is a cracking example of it.
Now, Mark Rainier would like that because that's getting more back to terroir.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, knowing where your spirit comes from, and if we trust that we've chosen the right cask and the right liquid. I'm not saying that we don't do big sherry bombs. We still do big cask strength, and we still do a wine cask collection because we're not closing ourselves off to that world. But I do think single cask expression from Douglas Laing and a refill bourbon hogshead really does hopefully put all the emphasis on right distillery, right cask, bottled at the right time. And we certainly have a pretty good rep, I think, for bottling. And we won't always get it right. And it's a nice thing about the family being so actively involved. And not a single blend from Douglas Laing and the regional malts will go out without a family member sampling it and signing it off. And same with the casks. When you look at our bottlings and you look at our labels, there's always a set of initials that are attached to the tasting note on an Old Particular. And it'll be FHL for Fred, it'll be CSL for Cara, or if you're unfortunate and you pick up one that says DGB, it's me, which is I'm not quite family, but I'm trusted with it. But the idea is like basically we put whiskey out into the world that we like, and as Fred says, it worked for them for now 3 generations of we like it, we think this cask is a good example, we're going to put it out in the world. Maybe there'll be times that we get it wrong, we won't get it right for every single person's taste, but we don't expect everyone going into a restaurant ordering the same food. So it's that level of we like it, we'll put it in a bottle.
Yeah. I tell you, an interesting thing is when I was talking to one of the guys in Australia, and he said, I was asking him about the regulations, like to be classified as Scotch, you've got to meet all the regulations of 3 years, and it's got to be done in a distillery in Scotland and aged in a warehouse in Scotland, and and the million other things that go with it. But in Australia, really, the only rule is it's got to be aged for 2 years and not in oak, but in wood. And so what people are doing over there is experimenting with all different types of wood. And what it made, it sort of threw a question up for me when I was talking to them. I thought, that's an interesting question for you, because the reason they're able to do that is because they're so small and independent, and they're not controlled by any big companies. So they're able to experiment and play around a lot. And do you find that is the case with Douglas Laing? That because of first off, because of your independence, and secondly, because you're not a massive corporation, you're a smaller business, that gives you that freedom to play around and experiment a bit?
Yeah, I think so. I think as an industry, I think we've kind of been driven by the creativity around the world, and we've certainly seen the kind of pressures of suddenly it was Japan, it was Taiwan, people really pushing the boundaries on what we can do with flavour. And we obviously have in Scotland the Scotch Whisky Association, or kind of the governing body, if you like, of what we can and cannot do. And there's always discussion about whether we reintroduce new things, or like there's essentially campaigning from our side and think we think this works and this should be allowed. And we're kind of as a lobbying tactic, I guess. But you look at things like the tequila cask we were just talking about a few years ago, that was not allowed. Tequila and mezcal casks were not allowed, right? And now they are. And then so you have different liquids finishing in oak, but then it doesn't mean that people aren't doing it in the background in terms of playing around with wood. It's interesting. So when I first tasted Strathearn, I tasted Strathearn spirit and chestnut, not in oak.
Oh, wow.
So these experiments are always ongoing, and I think maybe it surprises people that they're ongoing. A good example is probably Glen Murray. They do lots of fun, funky stuff, and they're obviously a much bigger distiller than us. So Glen Murray have played around with maple syrup casks and things like that. So there's definitely experimentation always going on, and we certainly have tried similar experimentations. And yes, maybe our advantage is we don't necessarily do it for a huge volume. We're not doing it for hundreds of casks. We might do 2 casks and see if they work, and then that could become a limited edition. And certainly Scallywag's a good example. Our Scallywag winter last year, we finished in ice wine casks, which there's very few places that have worked with ice wine in Scotland for Scotch whisky. So that's kind of out there. The year before, we worked with orange wine casks from south of Spain. So we definitely have the opportunity to play around, especially with the regional malts. We can test smaller batches of the blended malt as a limited edition and see the feedback and see what people think.
Yeah.
And then that allows us to maybe introduce it into the single cask world. So then with this year, we've done a lot of the cask finishing that we looked at for the regional series. We're now playing around with as single cask releases. So we just we released a Bowmore and tequila casks. So this is where we're starting to see like the advantage of being able to move from the regional malts as our kind of almost experimental arm, and then move that learning into the single cask world, where suddenly we can introduce a finish, or we can start looking at full maturation and different things.
What sort of impact are you finding? A lot of people are worried that there's a big downturn in Scotch whisky at the moment, and especially a lot of people in that 25 to 45 demographic are becoming very health conscious and taking a lot of health warnings and saying, well, you shouldn't drink alcohol anymore. And they seem to be swinging away from whiskies. That part one. Part two is the guys in Australia were saying that what they're finding is they're swinging away from the big brands, but they're not swinging away from the craft brands. And do you find that? Do you find there is a swing away in general, but more specifically, not so much of a swing away in the smaller craft brands?
Yeah, I think part one of your question, I think it takes one quick Google search to recognize that the last couple of years have been brutal. Like we've had, you see distilleries slow downs, you see people losing jobs. It has not been fun. It's been a real fight for the last couple of years of kind of pushing through and finding where you can pull back. And yeah, it's very much been a tough couple of years in the industry. And as I said, that's not new news out there. That's certainly out there in the public sphere. In terms of your kind of second point, I would say that I'm not saying that we have not suffered, I guess, in terms of like we've definitely obviously found a lot of challenges. I think there's more and more demand for people buying better and buying smaller volume. So therefore people are willing to maybe spend a little bit more money to get something of quality. We saw that kind of trend during the COVID years as well, of people treating themselves and spending that little bit more money. And I think for us, a lot of people don't forget that almost it's kind of like a lost generation of people that were turning 18 to 21 during COVID. They weren't out in the bars, they weren't being educated, they weren't getting the chance to go and sample different things, they weren't learning, and we lost a lot of the very knowledgeable bar backs and bartenders and kind of mixologists. We lost a lot of knowledge of people just moving out of the industry and people not experiencing that kind of world of bars and pubs and things like that as well. So there's a lot of work from our side to kind of recapture them, I think. But there's also always the argument that as much as we'd love it to be 18 to 35 as the perfect demographic for us leaning into and getting a younger audience, but when I was 20, I wasn't maybe having the spare money to buy a nice bottle of £100 single malt. So we've got to take that.
I agree with that.
I think we've got to take that with a pinch of salt a little bit. I think in terms of, I think there's definitely opportunity with this kind of current generation of non-drinking healthy elements. I think it's about how we talk about drinking moderation and therefore drinking better. It's not going back and throwing 15 pints down. It's having something super craft, super premium, and you really get bang for your buck with something like Scotch whisky because you have such an array of flavors, and a bottle doesn't go off. It's not like a nice bottle of wine where you're really in that 2-day window, 3-day window. It's Scotch whisky. Yes, we want it to be consumed, but you have a much longer window to consume something of high quality.
Yeah, the interesting thing is one of the guys, again in Australia, said that he said the same thing, that whereas 3 or 4 years ago, people were coming in and buying 4, 5, 6 bottles. Now they come in and they only buy one. But he said the good thing is they're still buying, but they're not buying as many. And
I think there's definitely a recalibration happening right now. And I think as long as you kind of step away, like my background's history, I love the history element of whiskey. And that's like how I got into whiskey, is with a history background.
Yeah.
But if you look at it, anything in like this small window and you zoom in really, really close, and you just have this instant drop off, and yes, it looks very brutal, but it doesn't take long to look back at the cycles of Scotch whisky to recognize that it ebbs and flows with demand. And no matter how we look at it, we're still selling more and making more than we've ever made before and we've ever sold before. And if you look at kind of a longer trend, we're still, since 2018 to 2019, doing a steady line if you zoom out. Whereas when you look at the spikes, yes, of course, it looks that way. I think there's a little bit of that. And certainly, yes, we obviously want to capture the attention of this younger generation coming through of drinking Scotch whisky. And I think we've learned a lot of that with the bartending cocktail world as well, to recognize that the cocktail world should be super premium ingredients that go into a cocktail. It's not just your cheap sugar and ways to get drunk. And I think we started to see that more and more, that like some of the best cocktails I've ever had were made with some super premium single cask expressions. That I think a lot of the older generations of whiskey drinkers might be like, oh my God, you're putting that into a cocktail. I would happily hold my hands up and say the best whiskey sour I've ever had was made using a Bowmore 30-year-old single cask. And for a lot of older whiskey drinkers, I think that will be very controversial. But I think people are recognizing, good quality ingredients create something of quality. So as far as I'm concerned, what could be more quality than single malt?
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about before too, about a whiskey drinkers becoming more curious about provenance and cask type. So
and transparency and knowing the background. We try and put as much detail on our labels, whether that's with the single casks or with the regional malts, giving the distilleries out there what type of wood we're using. It's all about an education campaign as well.
Yeah.
And that's still always an uphill battle. We are a small guy. We'd love it if the bigger guys did more on blended malt versus single malt. And this kind of blended malt is always a really tough category because of the storyline that we put out, that blends were somehow inferior to single malt.
Yeah.
And yet you have unbelievably good blends and you have terrible single malts. It's really very much, I think it's not necessarily a lost opportunity with this kind of health conscious. I think it's just about changing the education around whiskey drinking and recognizing that, you don't have to sit and drink 15 pints. You can have a couple nice drams, feel fine in the morning and still go to the gym. Like you can do both worlds.
Yeah. Well, listen, we've been going over an hour.
Yeah, time flies when you're having fun.
Time flies when you're having fun. So we might wrap it up, and I think we talked, when I talked with you and Chloe the other day, we're going to try and do another one of these a little bit later on.
Maybe it may be a good one. I'll see if I can get a Laing in as well, and see if they'd like to discuss a bit of their experience in the whiskey world. I'd like to say, excuse me, Cara's 20th anniversary, so it's a good chance to grab her for a kind of 20-year retrospective around Scotch whisky. So hopefully, if you have us back and the people ask us back, then we'll happily come in and talk about Douglas Laing again.
Okay. Well, Dougal, thanks, mate. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I think we covered a lot of ground too.
Yeah, it's the nice thing. I've worked for the big guys, and it's nice working for a business like this because every tasting is always different. I never know what I'm coming in to talk about because I get to talk about everything. There's no just one distillery story.
So that's it. That wraps it up for today. Thanks very much, everyone, for tuning in. I really appreciate it, and I'll catch you on the next one.